He pulled a rusty chain out of the water, thinking it was trash. But when he realized what it was attached to, everything around him froze. What began as a routine construction project turned into the discovery of a secret that had been hidden underwater for almost a century. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The morning mist still clung to the trees when David stepped out of his temporary cabin, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. The forest was heavy with silence, the kind that pressed against the ears and settled into the chest. He had been working here for 3 months now, and still the quietness of this northern wilderness made him uneasy. Back in the city, there had always been noise traffic, distant sirens, construction sites that never slept. Here, the only sounds came from wind moving through pine needles and the slow current of the creek that wound its way between the ridges. It was supposed to be a job like any other, an easy paycheck, another project before winter set in. But this land felt different. David was 45, with the hands of a man who had lifted more concrete than words in his lifetime. His face was lined from years spent beneath the sun, and his eyes, once a warm hazel, had taken on a muted color, like river stones beneath shallow water. He'd been a builder for 2 decades, always moving where the work took him. After the divorce, he had given up his small apartment near the harbor and taken contracts farther from civilization. Solitude didn't frighten him anymore. If anything, it made him feel less aware of time passing. The new project was ambitious, a luxury lodge built deep in the forest where the wealthy could disconnect and rediscover nature. That was what the investors had said when they introduced the plans. They wanted a structure that blended with the wilderness, though to David, there was nothing natural about pouring cement into a place like this. The earth here was soft, dark, and damp roots tangled under every footstep. Trees rose straight and tall, forming a wall of green that never seemed to end. The creek, Miller's Creek as the old maps called it, was the only feature that broke the monotony of the terrain. It ran quietly beside the clearing, narrow but deceptively deep, its water dark and slow, as if carrying secrets no one should disturb. The crew was a mix of men from nearby towns and drifters like him. They worked with the usual rhythm of heavy labor grunts, laughter, swearing, the metallic hum of machinery. Yet something about this site had changed even the loudest among them. The forest seemed to swallow their voices, making every sound fade before it could echo. By evening, most of them avoided wandering beyond the floodlights that surrounded the main area. When the sun dipped behind the hills, the darkness came fast and complete, like a curtain dropping on a stage. David had noticed things others hadn't, or perhaps they simply didn't care to notice. The birds were scarce, almost non-existent. The creek had no visible life. No darting fish, no insects buzzing above the surface. Even the smell of pine was dulled by a faint metallic tang that came from the water whenever the wind blew the right way. The locals, when asked, gave vague answers. An old truck driver once mentioned that there had been a fire here long ago, before the war, when this was the land of a man named Miller. Some said Miller had built a hunting lodge by the river, a grand one, but it burned one winter night with his family inside. No bodies were ever found. After that, the forest had reclaimed the place. David didn't believe in curses or ghost stories, but the thought lingered in his mind as the days went on. It was late summer when he first saw the chain. The morning had been hot, unusually so for this region. The air shimmered above the clearing, heavy with humidity. During his lunch break, David walked down to the creek to cool his hands. He crouched near the bank, his reflection rippling in the sluggish water. As he reached down, something caught the light beneath the surface. A glint of rusted metal, dull but persistent. He frowned and leaned closer. It wasn't just a piece of debris. It was a thick, corroded chain, half buried in the sand and silt, its links disappearing into the murky depths. He pulled gently at first, expecting it to move easily, but it didn't budge. The chain was anchored deep, unmoving, as though tied to something massive below. He tugged harder, and the sound that followed, a strained metallic groan, sent a shiver through him. It wasn't the sound of a loose object. It was the sound of something resisting. For a long moment he stood there, water dripping from his hands, staring at the spot. He felt a peculiar unease, as if the ground beneath him wasn't entirely solid. He told himself it was nothing. A piece of old logging equipment, maybe, or the remnants of a bridge that had once crossed the creek. Still, something about it drew him in. When he returned to the site, one of the younger workers asked where he had been. David mentioned the chain. The man laughed. "Probably some old trap or anchor," he said. "Don't waste your time, boss. This forest eats metal faster than fire." That night, David lay awake in his small cabin, listening to the rain. Each drop against the roof sounded too distinct, too isolated, as though the world had narrowed down to this one place and this one sound. At some point, through the steady rhythm of rain, he thought he heard something else. A faint clink, like metal tapping metal. It came in intervals, irregular, but deliberate, as if someone below the surface of the earth was dragging a length of chain. He rose, walked to the window, and looked toward the creek. The lights from the worksite were faint, just enough to illuminate the mist that hovered over the trees. The sound stopped as soon as he looked. He waited, but it didn't return. When he finally went back to bed, his thoughts were no longer of the project, but of what might lie at the end of that chain. The following day, the sky was gray and low, and the forest smelled of wet moss. The heavy machinery had broken down again, so most of the crew spent the day idling around the mess tent, smoking, complaining about delays. David found an excuse to walk to the creek again. The water had risen slightly overnight. The chain was still there, visible just beneath the surface, swaying gently with the current. He crouched again, brushing away debris from the links. They were thick, hand-forged, the kind used long before modern equipment. He followed it with his eyes until it vanished into the darker part of the creek. He tugged once more, but the chain refused to move. Instead, it gave a slow, moaning creak, and a bubble of air escaped from below, surfacing with a hollow pop. The smell that followed was faint but unmistakable. Burnt oil mixed with earth and decay. Something tightened inside him. He wanted to leave, to pretend he hadn't seen it. Yet curiosity rooted him there. He looked downstream, half expecting to see the other end, but there was only water and shadow. That evening, as dusk bled into night, he joined the others by the campfire. Someone had found an old bottle of whiskey, and the laughter grew louder as the flames rose higher. The talk turned to ghosts and lost gold, to the idea that every forest hides something it doesn't want to give up. When David mentioned his discovery, one of the older men looked at him through the smoke and said, "Chains don't stay buried without reason. If you pulled at it and it pulled back, leave it. Things buried in water are meant to stay forgotten." The words, said half in jest, stayed with him. That night, the metallic ringing returned, softer but closer. He dreamed of the chain stretching into the dark, and of something waiting at the end, something heavy and patient. 2 days later, when the rain finally stopped, he went back. He told no one. The forest felt unnaturally still. Even the creek seemed quieter, as though aware of his presence. He carried a crowbar and a flashlight, the tools of habit rather than purpose. Kneeling by the water, he began to dig around the spot where the chain disappeared. Mud and pebbles slid away, revealing more of the corroded metal. After nearly an hour, his fingers brushed against something solid. It was curved, Smooth in places, rough in others, a rim of metal perhaps, or the edge of a sealed lid. He cleared the muck, revealing a circular plate attached to the chain. It wasn't random debris. It was something constructed, deliberate, and old. He stared at it for a long while, his breath shallow, unsure whether to continue or cover it again. The metal was cold, even through his gloves. He pressed the crowbar against the edge, testing it. A hollow echo came from beneath the surface, deep and resonant. Whatever lay below wasn't small. A voice cut through the silence, his supervisor calling his name from the tree line. He startled, dropping the tool, then stood quickly, brushing mud from his hands. The man waved for him to return to the site. The moment broke, like waking from a half-remembered dream. As he walked back, David glanced once more at the creek. The surface was calm, undisturbed, as if nothing had happened. Yet he could still hear the faint metallic hum beneath the noise of wind and machinery. Something down there was waiting, held in place by rust and time. That night, as darkness fell over the camp, he couldn't shake the feeling that the chain had found him first. The rain returned that night, heavier than before, and by morning the creek had swelled, swallowing the edges of the bank where David had been digging. The air hung thick with the scent of wet earth and pine resin, the kind of cold dampness that crept under his clothes and stayed against his skin. Work had been postponed. The machines sank into the mud, and the men spent most of the morning inside the temporary canteen, complaining about delays, wages, and the endless gray sky. For the first time since the project began, David was glad to be idle. He needed time to think. He sat near the cabin window, drinking coffee gone bitter and cold, and watched the fog drift through the trees. His thoughts kept returning to the creek, to the chain and the cold metal beneath the water. He tried to reason with himself. Perhaps it really was nothing but an old boiler or some piece of logging machinery. But the sound it had made when he struck it, that deep, hollow resonance, had been too deliberate, too alive. It was not the echo of empty space, but of something sealed, waiting. As dusk approached, a strange unease crept through him. He could not explain it, but the idea of that buried object kept pressing on his mind, like a question that demanded to be answered. By the time the sun dipped behind the pines, he knew he would not be able to sleep without seeing it again. He waited until the camp lights dimmed, and the men retreated to their cabins. The forest was dark and wet, the ground soft under his boots. He carried a flashlight, a crowbar, and the same stubborn curiosity that had guided him his whole life. When he reached the creek, the fog was so dense he could hardly see the water. The beam of his flashlight cut through it in a narrow cone, illuminating the ripples that glimmered like molten steel. The chain was still there, barely visible beneath the surface, a dark line trembling with the current. He crouched and took it in his hands. The links were colder than the water itself, and as he pulled, the sound returned. A groan from the depths, a noise that seemed to vibrate through the ground and into his bones. He pulled again, harder this time, and the chain shifted, releasing a string of bubbles that rose to the surface and burst. Mud and debris began to swirl as he heaved with both hands. Slowly, reluctantly, the object below began to rise. At last, something broke the surface, a rounded, rusted shape, thick with silt and weeds. He kept pulling until a metal cylinder emerged, no larger than a barrel, but heavy enough that it barely moved, even with his full weight behind it. David leaned over it, catching his breath. The thing was old, very old. Its surface was pitted with rust, streaked with a reddish-brown patina that looked almost organic. He wiped away a layer of mud and saw faint letters stamped into the metal, nearly erased by time. They were too corroded to read clearly, but he could make out fragments. An M, maybe an I, then a faint number that looked like 3 or 8. The sight sent a strange pulse through him. He didn't know why, but he felt that whatever he'd found wasn't a tool or a machine. It was something human. A gust of wind rippled across the creek, and he thought he heard a sound, a soft rattle from within the cylinder, as though something small had shifted inside. The thought froze him. He imagined all the possibilities: a storage drum, a weapon, an old canister of chemicals. But something about the shape, the careful welding, the deliberate sealing suggested intent. This wasn't discarded. It had been hidden. He decided to haul it out completely. Using the crowbar as leverage, he pried the cylinder toward the bank, inch by inch. The chain clanked softly, and once again that deep hollow noise echoed when it struck the ground. His arms burned, his breath came ragged, but he managed to roll it far enough onto the shore to inspect it properly. Up close, it looked even stranger. The top was welded shut, though unevenly, as if done by hand. A loop of metal protruded from one side, where the chain had been fastened. Around the seams, he could see traces of melted solder, and beneath the rust, a faint smell of oil and something acrid burned wood, maybe. He placed a hand on the lid and felt a faint vibration, or perhaps it was only the trembling of his own pulse. For several minutes he just stared, uncertain of what to do. He had seen enough dangerous things in his line of work to know when to be careful. If it was military or contained old fuel, it could be lethal. Yet he couldn't bring himself to leave it behind. It felt wrong, somehow, to abandon it after pulling it from its grave. He wrapped the chain around his wrist, muttering to himself that he would move it somewhere safer and decide in the morning. Dragging it back to camp took hours. The ground was slippery, and the weight of the object seemed unnatural for its size. Every few steps he had to stop and catch his breath. When he finally reached the maintenance shed, a half-finished structure of tin and wood, he rolled it inside and covered it with a tarp. The whole time, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. That night, the dream returned. He saw the creek under moonlight, but it wasn't empty. A figure stood on the far bank, indistinct, its face blurred by mist. In its hands, it held the same chain, rust flaking away in its fingers. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It only pointed toward the water, where bubbles rose and burst like quiet heartbeats. He woke before dawn, his chest tight and his palms cold. When the crew gathered in the morning, he tried to appear normal. But his hands shook when he poured coffee, and he found himself glancing constantly toward the shed. One of the workers noticed and asked what was wrong. David shrugged it off, but a rumor spread quickly. Someone claimed to have heard him dragging something heavy through the mud last night. Another said they saw the shed light flicker. By midday, everyone was whispering about the thing in the water. It didn't take long before the foreman came knocking. He was a sharp, nervous man named Keller, more accountant than builder, sent by the investors to keep the schedule on track. When he demanded to know what was going on, David hesitated. The truth sounded ridiculous, even to his own ears. But when Keller insisted, David reluctantly led him to the shed. The moment Keller saw the shape under the tarp, he stepped back. "What the hell is that?" he asked. "Something I found in the creek," David said. "It's sealed. Could be from the war. I thought it might be safer here." Keller's expression hardened. "You brought it onto the site? Are you insane? If that's a bomb, we're sitting on a death trap." Within an hour, the police had arrived, followed by a small team from the local bomb disposal unit. The camp buzzed with excitement and fear as men gathered at a distance to watch. David stood apart, arms crossed, trying to ignore the knot tightening in his stomach. The officers moved cautiously. They examined the object, ran a detector over it, and conferred in low voices. After what felt like an eternity, one of them approached Keller and shook his head. "It's not explosive," he said. "Looks like a sealed storage container. Old. Very old." Relief swept through the crowd, followed by disappointment. The mystery wasn't dangerous, at least not in the way they had hoped. Still, the police decided to take it into custody for inspection. They loaded it carefully onto a truck, and before they left, one officer turned to David and said, "You did the right thing reporting it. This could be a historical artifact." That evening, the site felt hollow. Without the object in the shed, the place seemed emptier, though David couldn't explain why. The forest was silent again, but not the kind of silence that soothed. It was the silence of something waiting. 2 days later, the museum called. They wanted him to come in for the opening of the container, since he was the one who found it. When he arrived, the building smelled faintly of polish and old paper. The cylinder lay on a metal table under bright lights, surrounded by museum staff, a police officer, and a few reporters. One of the curators, a woman with gray hair tied neatly behind her head, explained that the seal had been cut carefully along the edge. They had found hand-welded joints and an inscription near the base, barely legible. Miller and Coeno, 1934. When the lid came off, the room filled with the smell of smoke and dampness, as if the forest itself had crept inside. Inside the cylinder were bundles of fabric, carefully folded and bound with wire. The curator lifted one out with trembling hands. It was a child's shoe, charred but intact. Then a stack of papers, blackened around the edges, each sheet covered in looping handwriting that had faded to brown. There were photographs, too. Sepia-toned images of a man, a woman, and 2 children standing before a wooden house. No one spoke for a long time. The curator placed the papers gently on the table. "They're letters," she said softly. "Mostly personal. Some addressed to family overseas. There's also a small metal locket." She opened it, and inside was a single word engraved in crude script. "Forgive." The sound that followed was not weeping, but something quieter. A collective breath drawn and never fully released. Even the reporters seemed subdued. David stared at the objects, at the ring of rust around the container, at the chain still attached to its side. He thought of how it had resisted him, how it had refused to move until he pulled with everything he had. It was as though it had been waiting for someone to free it, to unseal the silence it had guarded for nearly a century. When the curator turned off the lights, the last image David saw was the faint gleam of that chain resting on the floor beside the table. He couldn't help feeling that though the cylinder was open, something remained closed within him, something that had been disturbed but not yet understood. That night, back at the construction site, the air was thick and unmoving. The creek ran slower than before, its surface smooth as glass. Standing by the water's edge, David looked down and saw the faint reflection of the moon broken by ripples. Somewhere beneath that surface, the echo of what he had unearthed still lingered. He realized, with a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold, that he hadn't found the past at all. It had found him. The museum's cold, sterile light had faded from David's mind by the time he returned to the forest, but the image of that open cylinder haunted him still. For nights afterward, he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the small, charred shoe resting among the letters, the curve of the locket with the word, "Forgive," the look in the curator's eyes when she realized what they had found. The others had seen a piece of history. He had seen something that refused to stay buried. The construction resumed, but the place no longer felt the same. The workers went about their routines, but the forest had grown heavier, as if the air itself carried memory. The creek, which once murmured softly through the valley, now seemed almost silent. Its surface was still and dark, reflecting only the gray of the sky. Even the sound of machines felt muted, swallowed by the trees. David worked mechanically, his mind elsewhere. Every sound from the water drew his attention. He had read the brief article in the local paper, how the discovery had sparked curiosity in town, how historians speculated that the cylinder belonged to a family who had lived here before the Great Depression. They mentioned the Miller estate, a hunting lodge that had burned to the ground one winter night in 1934. The fire had taken the lives of a mother and 2 children. The father, Charles Miller, was presumed dead, but never found. The lodge's remains had been left to decay, its land eventually sold to developers. The name pressed against David's thoughts, like the rusted imprint he had seen on the metal. Miller and Contentang o Momokontbot, 1934. He had heard the name whispered by the old men when the project first began. Now it had come full circle, rising from the water to confront him. He began spending his evenings walking the perimeter of the site, tracing the edges of what might have once been the foundation of that lodge. Occasionally, he found fragments buried in the soil nails, shards of glass, a corner of a blackened brick. The ground was full of ghosts. The company, however, had no patience for ghosts. A week after the discovery, new representatives arrived from the city. They came in clean boots and pressed suits, driving shiny black vehicles that looked absurd against the mud. They gathered the supervisors, including David, for a meeting in the prefab office near the main road. The air smelled faintly of diesel and wet concrete. One of the men, a tall, silver-haired executive with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, did most of the talking. "What happened here is unfortunate," he said, as though referring to a scheduling error. "But it doesn't change our plans. We've been assured by the authorities that the site poses no legal or environmental risks. So, gentlemen, let's put this matter behind us. We don't want rumors turning into headlines." The word rumors made David stiffen. It wasn't a rumor. It was a family's life sealed in a metal tomb. He asked whether the land's history should be reconsidered, maybe preserved in some way. The executive looked at him for a long moment, then gave a dismissive smile. "You're a builder, Mr. Carter, not an archaeologist. Your job is to move forward, not backward." The conversation ended there, but something in David hardened. That night, he didn't return to his cabin. He drove to town instead, to the small library, where the museum's curator had told him the original town records were kept. The building was dim and quiet, smelling of dust and old wood. The librarian, an elderly woman with pale hands, guided him to the archives in the basement. The files were brittle, yellowed, their ink faded, but legible. The story unfolded piece by piece. The Miller family had indeed owned the land where the lodge once stood. Charles Miller, a craftsman and engineer, had moved here in 1928, designing his own home by the creek. His business thrived until the Depression struck. He lost everything in a single year: his factory, his savings, and, according to letters in the town record, his faith in himself. Then came the fire. The official report was brief. December 12th, 1934. Structure completely lost. 3 presumed dead. No remains recovered. There were rumors even then of insurance fraud, of debts owed, of madness. One witness, a farmer named Harlan Gray, had claimed he saw Miller at the creek that night, carrying something heavy wrapped in cloth. But no body was ever found, and the investigation quietly closed. David sat there long after the library closed, his hands gripping the edge of the table. The pieces fit too neatly. The man had lost everything, buried his family's memory under water, and sealed their possessions in metal. His final attempt at redemption. The word engraved on the locket was no accident. Forgive. He returned to the site the next morning, exhausted, but resolved. He couldn't shake the feeling that the company's indifference was wrong, almost cruel. They were paving over graves. The discovery had awakened something that deserved respect, not silence. Yet when he tried to bring it up with the supervisors, they shut him down. "It's not our concern," one said. "We're here to build, not pray for the dead." By afternoon, an email circulated from headquarters, strict orders, forbidding any discussion of the Miller case. Anyone caught talking to journalists would be dismissed immediately. The message ended with a single line: "Let the past rest." But the past, David thought, had already risen. A few days later, as the sun set behind the ridge, a car pulled up near the site. From it stepped a woman in her late 60s, wearing a wool coat and carrying a weathered folder under her arm. She asked for David by name. Her voice was calm, though her eyes carried something fragile and bright. She introduced herself as Helen Miller, the granddaughter of Charles Miller. She had read about the discovery in the paper and driven from another state to see the land where her family had once lived. When David brought her to the creek, she stood silently for a long time, watching the slow water slide past the stones. Her breath came out in small white clouds in the cool air. Then she opened her folder and handed him a faded photograph. It was the same family from the container: the man, the woman, and 2 children. "That's my grandfather," she said softly. "He wasn't a murderer. He tried to save them." She told him what little her family knew. Her father had been only a boy when the fire happened. He'd been staying with relatives in another town. Years later, he spoke rarely of it, only once saying that his father had been a man who carried guilt heavier than his own bones. Helen believed the container had been his confession, a message to those who would come after him. The 2 of them stood by the water until the forest dimmed. For the first time, David felt the weight of what he had unearthed, not as a mystery, but as an obligation. This wasn't about curiosity anymore. It was about justice, however small. When the company learned about Helen's visit, they were furious. The executives arrived the next day, their voices sharp with threat. They accused him of trespassing professional boundaries, of endangering the project. They offered him money, more than he had ever earned in a year, if he would sign a non-disclosure agreement and leave quietly. He refused. The moment he said no, he knew he had just ended his job. Word spread quickly. Some workers looked at him with sympathy, others with fear. Keller, the foreman, avoided his eyes. By evening, David packed his things and left the cabin. But before he drove away, he stopped once more by the creek. The water glinted faintly in the fading light. He could almost see the shadow of the chain beneath the surface, still resting where he had first found it. The next morning, the newspapers carried a new story. A local historian, tipped off by anonymous sources, had connected the discovery to the old Miller fire. The town council announced a temporary suspension of all construction activities pending review. Public interest swelled. Visitors came to see the creek, to stand where the past had resurfaced. Helen returned for a small ceremony organized by the museum, where the letters and photographs were displayed behind glass. The caption read, "Artifacts of the Miller family. Recovered, 2025. David watched from the edge of the crowd, unseen. He didn't care for recognition. What mattered was that the truth had finally been spoken aloud. The land was no longer mute. Weeks passed. The company eventually abandoned the project. The land was transferred to the county's historical trust, designated as a memorial site. The machines were removed, and the forest began to reclaim what had been disturbed. Moss grew over the old foundations, and the sound of birds returned, faint but real. David found work elsewhere, smaller projects, nothing that mattered much. Yet he carried the memory with him, the sound of the chain breaking the surface, the smell of rust and soil, the word etched into the locket. Sometimes, in the middle of a quiet night, he imagined he could still hear the faint, metallic hum beneath the water. One autumn morning, nearly a year later, he returned. The drive felt shorter than before. Though the road was unchanged, the forest greeted him with a hush, as if recognizing him. The path to the creek was overgrown, the old construction camp gone. When he reached the bank, he stood for a long time, listening. The water moved lazily under the pale light. He could still see the glint of metal below, a single link of the chain, resting like a scar against the earth. He knelt, dipped his hand into the cold water, and let the current flow between his fingers. The forest was quiet, but not empty. The silence felt clean now, not oppressive. It was the silence of peace, not of secrecy. "Now you're free," he whispered. The water carried his words away, rippling outward in slow, perfect circles. He watched until they faded, until all that remained was the reflection of the trees swaying above him. For the first time in years, he felt no weight on his chest. The chain, once rusted and unyielding, had become part of the creek's slow rhythm, a memory, no longer a burden. When he rose to leave, a soft breeze stirred through the branches, carrying with it the faintest echo of metal against stone. It was almost like a sigh, or perhaps a thank you. He didn't look back. The truth had been found, the dead had been remembered, and the man who once built walls for a living had finally learned to uncover what lay beneath them. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch the next story, and share this video with someone who believes the past never truly disappears.